Hello and welcome to CMajor before the show. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate that you are listening to the podcast. Thank you for those who are interacting with us on social media. It's very fun to see you react to some of the things that we post. And it's a lovely Saturday afternoon. What can I say? I'm just really happy to be here. And I want to share with you for a few moments today just our thoughts about chords, music, and effects. So get ready because we're going to play some sounds for you that you may or may not have heard on the podcast. And so we'll just see how it goes. How about that? But I have a number of things on my mind today. And if you're doing a podcast yourself, you know how it is from week to week. You're thinking you're going to talk about one thing, and then when you get into it, you end up talking about another thing. Also, the sound. You'll notice that the sound has been changing a little bit. If for some reason the microphone that we use, if it starts to freeze, or somehow the recording starts to freeze, what we'll do is just come back and do a part 2 of the show. How's that sound? Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. It's been an interesting week, guys. It really has been an interesting week. I mean, across the week, I've seen some of my students. I've had a chance to work with them on things that they are interested in working on. And then, of course, I'm thinking about my own music making. Where do I want to take that next? Do I want to go back to open mics? Do I want to create my own platform performance? Do I want to perform from a teaching perspective, or do I want to perform from a podcasting perspective, or do I just want to perform from a performer's perspective? You know, all those things I'm just working out in my mind, and I want to make sure that whatever it is that I do, that I bring to you, that it's something that you really want. You know, I was listening to this interview during the week, and it really made me think that just because you want to do something may not be what your listeners want to hear from you or what people are expecting from you. And so I think you have to be really careful of that. That's what I mean about the whole invitation thing. You know, it's nice to be invited to something because then you know that the person or the people involved really want you there, or they want to see you doing that thing, and then all you have to do is just go along with it or agree with it. But it gets hard sometimes if you have in your mind, if you are a dreamer type, if you are the type of person that dreams big, and then you think, oh, wow, I just had this dream. I had this daydream. I want to do this on stage. And then you present it to certain people, and then they may go, well, why would you want to do that? Why would that be something you would want to do? Don't do that, do this. So it's interesting, but we're working it all out. Chords. Who wants to hear about chords? I thought you did. That's one of our effects that we use here on the podcast because I like to make the show sound like I have a live audience. And I do have a recorded live audience. How about that? And so another effect that I like to use on the show would be this one because I like to add humor. I am not a comedian. I've been told by people in my family that I'm funny. I've been told by friends and people that I meet, you know, you're funny. You say funny things. But I don't consider myself a comedian. I consider that to be a serious profession, you know, for people who really know how the art of making people laugh. But I do like to keep it lighthearted from time to time because I can get really heavy sometimes going into these topics about music and music history. So it might get a little heavy today, just so you know. But what's another effect we play? We like to play this one as our homework effect. And then I have another one that may or may not stay with us, but we'll see how it goes. those are really the top 4, maybe top 5 effects that I play here on my app. And so they may or may not stick with us, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, chords, music, and effects. We've been talking a lot about chords. I've been also talking with you about going in ABC order when it comes to chords. And so we'll try to talk a little bit about that over at the CMajor radio show, because I want to touch a little bit more on the E chord. Now, would you know an E chord when you hear one? That's the question. All right, I'm going to play some music. I'll be right back in a moment to give you some more notes to consider. You're listening to CMajor Before the Show. Okay, and we're back. You're here on CMajor Before the Show. It is a beautiful Saturday afternoon here in the greater New York City area. So lots of people are out and about. The weather is, I would say, comfortable. It feels comfortable. It doesn't feel too hot. It doesn't feel too cold. And you can wear a nice windbreaker or something light to get through the weather. There's no rain in sight. I mean, can you believe that? There's no rain, it's just sunshine. So soak it all up while you can. Some of the leaves are still turning on the trees and so forth. But here we are. So I have on my mind to talk about chords, but I want to talk about it from a historical perspective. I'm thinking about some composers that I hear when I listen to classical music across the week. If I listen to music as I'm driving somewhere, I may hear the music of this composer named Still. Do you know him? His name is, I believe, let me say it here correctly. And I'm looking in this book here. I believe his full name is William Grant Still. And so the reason why I want to bring up his work, and I'm going to include some of his music this week in the homework assignment. Last week we did talk about the Classical Music Lover's Companion to Orchestral Music, and I think the week before that too. But I did not see William Grant Still's name mentioned in this book, and I think I know why, because a lot of his music is still becoming well-known. This companion is really for every well-known piece of orchestral music. So, of course, if you're talking about the composers such as Corelli or Shostakovich, you will hear some of their most frequently performed works, including symphonies, concertos, overtures, suites, and ballet scores. And so the author does talk about that. He's saying that he's organized his book alphabetically from Bach to Beethoven to Walton to Webern. And so if you're a classical music enthusiast, as I am, then you would read about a lot of music that you hear on the radio already. But this composer I wanted to bring out because I was talking about keeping it simple. Keeping it simple when it comes to writing harmonies. How do you do that? Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to write simply. And I like that he alludes to that. And I think for the homework assignment, I'm going to put it up on CMajor's Classroom and see if you can listen to the music of William Grant Still and listen to what he does with the harmonies. So for example, the Afro-American Symphony, he wrote using a blues theme in later movements in various ways. And then he wrote himself, of course, after the critics were starting to write about his work, he wrote himself that the harmonies that he used in the symphony were conventional, except in a few places, but he wanted to use a style of harmonization to show simplicity in the music. And he had his own reasons for doing that. So listen to it. See if you find that's the case. And when you listen to it, do you hear where the changes are? If you're listening for changes. I myself have challenged myself after having many conversations with my students about the type of music they want to learn in their lessons. And the challenge was for me to start listening to more jazz, trying to play jazz a little bit more, not from an academic standpoint, but to really try to play it from a standpoint of someone that is listening for the first time and seeing if I can follow where the changes are. How would I use those same changes, or how would I go about learning to play those same changes? It's just a challenge, because I do come from that school that a lot of my friends came from, where you just take the piece of music that's in front of you and you read it, and that's what you do, and you make music out of what's on the page. But this is a different approach for me. So even in the past, if I've taught students a little bit about jazz harmony, a little bit about blues, it wasn't because I'm performing jazz and blues myself. It's because I have an idea of how to show them. But to really jump into it from a perspective of someone who may not read as well and they really rely on their ear. That person relies on how the changes are and how the harmony should unfold in their own minds. And I will say this, it's not the first time I've tried, because when I was in grad school, I ran into a classmate who was doing the same thing. Read music very, very well, was a saxophonist, invited me to go out to this place in New York. I don't know if it's still there, but it was called the University of the Streets. The problem with that is that it started like 2 o'clock in the morning, which is really, really early in the morning for me, and definitely late at night to be out and about waiting for the class to start. But a lot of people were gathering there to find out how to play jazz. So here we go. And not just jazz, blues also. So listen to, if you can, the music of William Grant Still and see what you find there in terms of the harmonies. That's going to be one of the homework challenges for this week. And so recently I mentioned here on the podcast that there is a concert series that's taking place in Princeton that's going to compare side by side the music of Dvorak and Burleigh. I believe that's what they're aiming to do. So I want to just read a little bit about that, because if you're following the podcast, you know that I've mentioned this. And so I just want to mention it now in the name of harmony, in the name of chords, if you will. And you know how it is with the resources that we use. If it's something that you want to get your hands on, let us know. We'll happily share that with you. Okay, so under the heading in our book that we use, one of our books that we use, symphony orchestras, opera companies, and choral societies. Okay, so the name of Burleigh should be mentioned somewhere on this page. Let's see if it is, or maybe it's up higher on the page. Yep, there it is. Okay, so I think he was known as a baritone. That's what it says here. That's one of the things they mention. So a lot of choral arrangements came from him. And then if we turn to another page, let's see what it says here. I did not really look at this ahead of time, and then my lighting is different today. So students who studied at the National Conservatory of Music in New York during the 1890s, along with Burleigh, and then they list others. Okay, so he apparently was a part of an opera company or choral societies. Which, by the way, did I ever tell you that I did sing with the New York Choral Society? Sometimes I tell that story. Okay, now let's go to another page. Okay, so here's an oratorio that was produced that included Burleigh as well. By the way, Burleigh is spelled Burleigh. And this oratorio was produced in the early 1900s, like around 1909. That's what it's saying here. Okay, let's look up another one for Burleigh. Maybe one or two more. And so I'm not seeing yet the side-by-side comparison between him and Dvorak, but I bet if I look up Dvorak, I may see something about Burleigh here, along with Dvorak. Okay, so they're just mentioning him that he was a part of, believe it or not, he was a part of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, commonly known as ASCAP. And ASCAP was organized in 1914 for the purpose of protecting the rights of copyright owners whenever their music was performed publicly for profit. Okay, so now today we also have BMI as well, so there's a similar association, BMI, and so, but it turns out that Mr. Burleigh was a part of ASCAP, professional musician. Okay, let's read one more, because then we're going to go into, I would like to mention, Dvorak, and then after that, Florence Price. So let's see. Let's go a little bit deeper in the book and see what it has to say there. Okay, so this is interesting because on the same page it does mention Florence Price, but I want to see where Burleigh is in relation to that. Okay, so they're just saying that he was among the composers / educators, those who won frequently over the years. They won awards including Burleigh, Nathaniel Dett, and others, and then Florence Price was also mentioned as one of the newcomers. Okay, so he was an award-winning composer. Now let's see where Dvorak is mentioned in all of this. And I want to know if they're going to mention Dvorak, or if this book rather mentions Dvorak along with Burleigh, if the two really go hand in hand. So Antonin Dvorak, let's see, the first time we hear about him, it's a little earlier in the book. Okay, so here they just give his dates, and apparently he was a person that, was a patron, and he was listed here as Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak, and then they give his dates as 1841 to 1904. Okay, so a very important patron of the time. And then let's see if we can go to another page. where he's mentioned and in what context. Okay, so here it just talks about his symphony from the New World, and it's the number 9 in E minor. Now, you know what I want to do? I want to go to the Classical Music Lovers Companion and to see if they mentioned Dvorak in that book. So let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay, so side by side. Okay, so I'm going to read directly from the book. I hope you'll bear with me on this. So it just puts it in historical context. It says that it was not until the decade of the 1890s that a nationalistic school of music actually got underway in the United States. Antonin Dvorak started it all. Soon after, he came to America as director of the National Conservatory in New York in 1892. He revealed his enthusiasm for the folk music of the land and called for the formation of an American school of composition. So I think this is where Dr. Harris was talking about. He was saying that a lot of European music became composed and became less improvised. And I think you hear some of that. And it just put me in the mind also of this video that I saw this week. You know, it was, believe it or not, I'm saying believe it or not a lot today. I don't know why. Yeah, we need some laughter for that, lighten things up a little bit. But I saw this video of, I couldn't believe it. It was Duke Ellington at the piano for over an hour, just him and the piano. I don't recall who he was talking to, but it was this post on YouTube, just amazing. And what I saw was him just at the piano playing his famous tunes, and it was the first time I really heard him just play solo like that. So whoever posted that video, I mean, thank you for posting that. It was just nice to hear how he talked about the music and the music of the time. And it just made me feel like, you know, there's a difference between somebody who's a composer, who really understands how to write music and read music well and how to put sounds together. It's a difference between that person and somebody who just strictly performs on piano. And it's just a difference. You can see it in the person when they're playing the piano, and you can hear the difference as well. But to see him sitting there, literally you can see his mind just working at work, and to hear his compositions played by him on the piano was just really remarkable. But let's go back to this book here. And so, composition, that's what we're talking about. Composition versus improvisation. And it says that Dvorak became particularly fond of one of his students, which was Mr. Burleigh, Harry Burleigh, and spent many hours listening to him sing the folk songs of his people and discussing with him the possibilities for utilizing the folk music as the basis for composition. So imagine that. You know, folk songs are songs that are passed down to generations. A lot of it may even be improvised, you know, but to have that conversation, the two of them talking, to say, you know what if you presented this in a more composed sense? What if you really focused on putting the folk music that you know that's been passed down generations and turn it into composition? And so Dvorak himself ended up using some of this music, and there's a huge quote in here about that. So it's going to be really, really interesting. I'm going to see if I can go to that concert. Let me look at the dates on that again. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to turn my background music up so it doesn't seem so dry. But I was really fascinated to see that. Oh, there it is. Okay. Whoa. Is this week? Okay, so if you are interested, it's part of the Concert Classic series this Thursday, as a matter of fact, the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and they're going to present a concert program at 8 o'clock, and it's called, well, that part in the program is called New World Spirit, and it's featuring Harry T. Burleigh, and then Southland Sketches, and then Dvorak Quintet for 2 violins, 2 violas, and cello, and E-flat major, Opus 97. Bernstein, Clarinet Sonata, and then Copland. Whoa, that's going to be an amazing program. Amazing. Okay, so I have to read this quote now. Maybe that's why this was on my mind. Maybe I just subliminally saw this date, and now it's coming to mind that this coming Thursday at 8 o'clock, we're going to have this amazing concert. So the way they printed in the season brochure, they say, we began 126 years ago and 910 miles away in the small town of Spillville, Iowa. Just as Princeton University Concert was born, Czech composer Antonín Dvorak composes his string quintet, Opus 97 in American farm country, drawing on folk tunes and spirituals, many of which he learned from his assistant, African-American composer Harry T. Burleigh. Dvorak sets the stage for a new tradition of American music. Here, this lineage evolved in a program also featuring Leonard Bernstein's very first published work and culminating in one of the most beloved American masterpieces, Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring, and its original instrumentation. As a pupil of one of Dvorak's students, Copland wrote this music for Martha Graham's ballet celebrating American pioneers. And then there's an invitation. Don't you love invitations? We invite you to come celebrate the frontier of our rich cultural history as together we launch our 126th season. Okay, so that's going to be this Thursday if you can attend at 8 o'clock. I myself will be finishing up teaching piano lessons. I don't think I can attend that, but it does look amazing. If I could go to that, I would. So if you go, let us know. Let us know if it's something you're able to put on your calendar. And so let's jump now to the music of Price. It's just nice to read about history, isn't it? So the reason why I think I have Florence Price on my mind is because I'm hearing a lot of her music, it seems lately, on New York Public Radio classical station. So 425, 426, and 433. Okay, so we just read about her being one of the newcomers. Let's see what it says over on the next page. So I did mention this probably way back in an early broadcast, maybe even across the summer. And it's such a great photo. It shows Florence Price conducting. It shows a pianist sitting at the piano playing Florence Price's piano concerto with the Women's Symphony Orchestra of Chicago, and this was in 1934. Such an amazing picture that is. And so I would say listen to some of her music. I want to know, was there a sound? I want to know like the correlation between these composers, if they all decided to keep the harmony simple, or was the simplicity of folk songs the one thing that drove the harmonies to be simple in the first place. Sometimes I feel like, and I had a professor who told me, you know what, we want to hear you play the music you played in church. Well, there are a lot of different church experiences. That doesn't mean that my church played the same music of another church, but I knew what he meant. And so sometimes when you go from one community space to another community space, the harmonization is different. You may have one community space that tries to play more with a jazz flair, and then others that want more traditional. They don't want to hear the harmony performed that rich, if that makes sense. They'd rather keep the harmony simple or play it the same way that you see it in the hymn book. And then the interesting thing about going to that jazz workshop that I went to a couple of weeks ago, here you have a professor that says never play what's on the page. If you play what's on the page, you're forbidden to play what's on the page, basically. But use the page as a guide. To have that perspective was just such a rich perspective, really, on how to make music and to really make something out of what you're seeing and just use it as a guide. But let's see here what else it says about Price. Let's see. I read this passage before, but I just wanted to see if there's something else here that we can bring out. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we mentioned that she was in Chicago. So they were saying that it was in 1933 that the Chicago Symphony played her symphony. So it probably was just such an amazing time. Oh yeah, and then the Philadelphia Orchestra, okay, and then the New York Philharmonic. So all of this is mentioned more or less in the same breath. So who knows how many hundreds of performances have taken place with these composers' music, and now we're in the 21st century, maybe thousands. One more place I want to go, just so we're staying on the same page. Let me see if I can adjust my voice here. How's my equalizer working? Okay, let's go back. Okay, now I want to see if, since Steele, Price, and Burleigh are not mentioned in this book, and Dvorak is mentioned, let's see what they say. Let's go to Symphony Number 9. Let's see if the author of this book talks at all about where this music came from and the harmonies. So it's just so interesting, isn't it? Okay, so 236. Okay, so if you listen to, oh, here we go. This is great. I'm going to turn this music down a little bit. So Symphony Number 9 in E minor. Such an important symphony. I love this symphony. So at the height of his fame in the 1890s, Dvorak spent 3 years in America as director of the new National Conservatory in New York. Over the winter of 1892 to 93, he read Henry Longfellow's poetry and was captivated by its cadences and had the idea that his epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha, could provide the theme for an opera libretto or a cantata. Then in the summer of 1893, he spent 4 months at Spillville, a little community predominantly of Czechs in the Great Plains of Iowa. And then, quote unquote, he said it was strange there are endless acres of field and meadow, and that is all you see. And then you don't meet a soul. Here they only ride on horseback. Imagine that. And then you're glad to see the woods and the meadows, the huge herds of cattle, which summer and winter are out at pasture in the broad fields. As for the music that Dvorak wrote while he was in America, this symphony, the cello concerto, a string quartet, and a quintet, he wrote, I should never have composed these works. Just so, if I hadn't seen America. And then the New World Symphony was commissioned by the New York Philharmonic Orchestra and premiered by them under Seidel, I believe that's how you say his name, Anton Seidel, in December 1893. There was another important American influence on his music, the spirituals and work of songs of African Americans, which Dvorak said were distinguished by unusual and subtle harmonies. Ooh, there you go. Okay, so in our discussion about chords, which is why we talk about chords on this program, see if you can listen to the harmonies, and compare those side by side. Some of these other composers that I mentioned on today's podcast episode, and I will list them in CMajor's classroom as part of your homework assignment. So feel free to look for that on our blog. And so the like of which I have found in no other songs but those of old Scotland. Wow, he's comparing that to Scotland and Ireland. Although he did not make a habit of quoting particular songs, you can hear the influence of spirituals and the sense of great open spaces in the New World Symphony. So I love that they're putting Copeland on the program too in Princeton. I just love the music of Copeland, just these wide open harmonies that he uses. And I could probably say a little bit more about the music of Copeland maybe next time. I think I may have to check out this book again so that I can, from the library, so that I can keep reading some of this and then sharing with you, hopefully some inspiration for learning more about chords and harmony. I'm going to close the book now because I'll get carried away and I will sit here for hours just reading about chords, reading about harmony and music history and all of that. So you are listening to C Major Before the Show. I'm going to come back because we've been talking about music, we've been talking about chords, we talked about effects. I'm going to come back because I have some ideas for making this podcast stand out even more in terms of how we use the microphone on the podcast and the sound that we use. And I'm going to say more about that back in one moment. You're listening to C Major Before the Show. To our podcast, C Major Before the Show. C Major Before the Show, by the way, if you don't know anything about the podcast, what we aim to do is to talk to you about things that are on our minds and to say what's coming up on the C Major radio show. So that's what it means about C Major Before the Show. But I have a feeling it's going to take on a whole different meaning, especially if I start to perform again and figure out what it is I want to perform in the first place. You know, one of the most liberating things I ever did was to start writing and performing my own music, and to be invited to do that in the city was just amazing. So a shout out to the handlers of that, the open mic nights there in New York. I want to give them an applause. You guys are so amazing. I mean, you're one of the first people that tried to put me on the map for playing in the greater New York City area. Me along with a couple of my, friends and co-workers when I used to work in professional audio. And so I have that on my mind today. Speaking of audio, there's going to be a huge show coming up this coming week. The Audio Engineering Society, they do these shows every year. And so we're lucky enough to have one in New York. And so it came across my desk, and the invitation came across my desk too.